an amazingly predictive stat now for success on professional golf tours around the world, just looking at how far a player hits the golf ball. In fact, I'd put a very strong mathematical argument on the fact that it is the most predictive factor for success on tour, and we'll talk a little bit about how that applies to amateur golfers as well. But you know, in general, let's just take a few little snapshots of a couple years here over the last little bit. If we look back to like 2017 and we took an average of how much money was made by the top 10 most accurate drivers on the PGA Tour, we would find that those players on average made about $10 million total for that entire group of 10, so averaging about $1 million a player. And their average FedEx Cup rank at the end of the year turned out to be an average of 122.5. So we are talking about literally the players that hit the ball the straightest on the PGA Tour, which as golf coaches, I feel like is a very important thing and something we talk about a lot, which is being able to be incredibly accurate off the tee. We're finding that on average, those players that do that the best on the PGA Tour are averaging at a point where they almost lose their PGA Tour card. Now, if you take that same number and look at that overall data for the players that are the longest on the tour, your top 10 in driving distance, combined they made $34.5 million, so 3.5 times what those players that were accurate made, and their average rank was around 65. We move on to 2018, so let's take another year of time here for these players. We saw some really great things happen. Number one, the players on the accuracy list actually made twice as much money in 2018. So they went from a total earnings of 10 million to a total earnings of about 20. Now, their average rank also went up significantly. It went up to about 50, 55. Which is a significant improvement. Now, your guys on the distance chart still crushed them. I mean, it was still like 2 to 1 or so on total earnings and money, and you also saw that those players had an average rank of even 40. What was really cool is if you start to really dig into these stats, we saw that the players on the accuracy charts actually increased their distance by 8% that year. So this is something I think that's incredibly important when we start to talk about speed and power in the golf swing, because I think the traditional thought was that if I'm going to learn how to hit it farther, it's going to negatively affect my ability to be consistent, to be accurate, or to keep the ball in play. And what we're seeing is that that's just not true. That's not what we're really seeing on tour especially. We're finding that as these players become more efficient, become more athletic in the way they swing the golf club, that this is resulting in not only more speed and power, which is great, but it's also starting to add a lot of benefit to consistency and centeredness of contact and repeatability and all these other pieces. So I think an overview piece of the world of speed and power has to do with athletic efficiency. And helping players become more athletically efficient is going to help them with every aspect of their game. Now, I think it's also really important to note, and I want to go back to this idea of predictive factors for success on tour. And this one gets me in trouble sometimes, I'm not going to lie, especially with groups of PGA professionals, which I'm a PGA professional, I love talking about these things, but let's talk about putting for a second. You probably didn't think we were going to talk about putting in the speed talk, but let's look at that. So, how many people think putting is really important to the game of golf? All right, that's normal. How many people think that putting or putting stats, putting efficiency is something that we can use as a predictive factor for success on tour? All right, I'm going to prove you guys wrong on that right now. So let's take a look at a couple stats. My favorite is strokes gained, right? So strokes gained is a stat that pretty much compares that player to the entire field over the course of the year, okay? So in 2018, the player that led the tour in strokes gained putting, so essentially gained the most strokes on the field, on the putting green over the course of the season, okay, was Greg Chalmers. Where do you think he finished in 2018? He finished 184th, okay? That's not too good, right? Another stat we can look at, which I wouldn't say is as good of a stat to use, but if we look at total putts per round, 2018, that player was Daniel Summerhays. Where do you think he finished? He actually did worse. He was at 194. So both of those players lost their card. Crazy stuff. This actually continues. If we look at 2019, it was Denny McCarthy who finished number 1 in strokes gained putting. Now this was interesting. I was actually over in Paris last week doing some workshops with the French PGA and the French Golf Federation. I asked that group of like 200 people, and I'm gonna say at least 80% of them spoke English and could understand me. I asked them how many people even knew who Denny McCarthy was, and not a single one raised their hand. So just the idea, but he actually finished on that list. He finished at 111. So what I would say is this, is that from a season-long statistics perspective, you cannot look at putting stats as being something that's overall predictive of success. And here's why, and we can kind of look at this, but think of it this way. If I've got Rory McIlroy, so a player that bombs it off the tee and hits it a long way, right, against like that kind of Denny McCarthy player that's accurate, really good putter, doesn't hit it that far, and let's look week to week at their ability to do well on tour. What happens when Rory McIlroy goes out on tour and has a really good week on the greens? When he does really well and his putting stats are really good that week, what happens? He wins, right? And he doesn't usually just win. He wins by like 5 or 6 shots, like blows the field away that one week where he has a really good time around the greens. But it's that ability for him to hit the ball a long way and consistently be out there in front of all those players that as soon as the rest of that game kind of lines up for him that week, he's going to win the tournament. Now, you take that like Denny McCarthy type player, that player that doesn't hit the ball as far. In order for that player, you know, well, let's say this. What happens if he has a bad week putting, bad week around the greens? Misses the cut, right? No chance. So like, Rory McIlroy probably doesn't miss the cut even if he has a bad week putting. He's probably might not win, might not get a top 10, but like that player that doesn't hit it a long way, the problem there is that if he doesn't have a good week in every aspect of his game, he's got a very good chance of missing the cut that week at that tournament. Whereas these players that bomb it off the tee, they can get away with a lot of other subtle inefficiencies in that week-to-week stat changes of different aspects of their game, and they can still make cuts, still earn money, and still earn those season-long points that keep them ahead of the game. So that's one of the things. It's so important to look at that.